Welcome to episode 41 of The Checklist, brought to you by Secure Mac. I'm Ken Ray.
I'm Nicholas Raba.
And I'm Nicholas Tacek.
Now you may be thinking, how can I trust that this is Nicholas, and Ken? Okay, you're probably not. I mean, we only have access to your ears here, but what if we wanted access to your data? For that, you would want to take special care to make sure that we are who we say we are. And of course, we would want to make sure that you're who you say you are too. Passwords, PINs, text message codes, secret questions, even hardware dongles. There are all sorts of ways to prove that we are who we say we are and that you are who you say you are. On this edition of The Checklist, we're talking authentication, authorization, and the difference between the two. Running down the items on today's list, why do we even need authentication? Authentication is not authorization. There are three major categories of authentication factors that we'll talk about. We'll explain the three types of authentication. And finally, we'll talk about why even two-factor authentication isn't perfect. Now, I think this one's kind of a no-brainer, but let's go ahead and state it explicitly. Why do we even need authentication?
Well, we're all familiar with the situations where we use passwords, and we understand why we need to use them. If someone is going to go on Amazon and make a purchase with their credit card, they should be able to prove that they're allowed to access that account. The same principle applies whether you're logging into social media or running licensed software. Authentication isn't merely the act of supplying a password, however. From a user's perspective, you punch in your username and password, press submit, and then, assuming you avoided any typos, the site opens the door for you. Behind the scenes, though, there's a lot more going on. The website needs to determine the validity of your password. More often, it may need to do even more than that by authenticating that you're also the actual owner of that password. An additional step, authorization, can also occur, especially if we're talking about computer or software systems, and we'll touch on that in a minute. We need this complex but largely invisible process because it's a fundamental element of security. Otherwise, no one would be able to have private, personal accounts, and anyone could impersonate anyone else. We need authentication because we need a reliable way to safeguard secure, sensitive data. But how does your computer or a website or anything else know whether you supply the correct password? Early on, we relied on the most basic method, one that would make computer security pros everywhere kind of shudder and cringe today, which is plain text storage. At the time, after creating your account, a server would store your username and your password as a pair in a database, as is, just like writing your information down on a sticky note and putting it in your desk drawer. When you sent your login request, the computer would just compare what you sent in with what it had on file. If it matched, you're good, you're authenticated. Now, that method hasn't been the case for a very long time, outside of the absolute most insecure sites. Those usually end up hitting the news when there's a data breach. Storing passwords in plain text today would be grounds for a security scandal. And for a good reason, because all it takes is for one clever hacker to break into that server and steal the database, and everybody in that database now has a problem. Storing passwords in the clear is really easy, but it provides no security for your password or your private information. So today, the primary method for storing passwords and authenticating user input at a later time is called hashing. At its root, hash functions and algorithms are very mathematically complex. They must be in order to provide good security. What these are not, though, is actual encryption. That implies something else altogether, namely that if you have the correct decryption key, you can unlock whatever you encrypted to start with. And that's not the case here. Once a password has been hashed, it is ideally very difficult to work backwards from that point. That's the whole point of hashing. So, to briefly explain how hashing works, when you create your password for the first time on a website, the server applies a complex mathematical function to the text after it's converted into binary information. The nature of these algorithms varies depending on the hash method used, but the general idea is the same for all of them. To introduce variations, modern hash functions include what's called a salt, a random value assigned to your password during its computation. The result, after all of that math is said and done, is an alphanumeric string of fixed length. the website stores this string securely along with the original salt value. When you go to log in again, the password you entered is hashed using the salt value stored with your username. The system then compares the hash of the password you entered against the hash stored for your username. If the two hashes match, you're authenticated and can have access to your account. This entire process is the foundation of a great deal of authentication around the web, as it prevents secure information from passing over insecure channels. Now, as we said before, it's very difficult to work backward from a hash to derive the password itself. And that's especially true with modern algorithms, which use both very long strings and complex salting methods. Think of it as being asked to factor a huge number. When you multiply numbers together, getting the answer is easy. If you just tell someone that huge number, the final number, and tell them, hey, figure out what two numbers I multiplied together to get this number, suddenly that task takes a lot more time. And there's a lot more that can occur with hashing, but now you kind of understand the basics of what's going on behind the scenes. It's the technology that powers our ability to authenticate ourselves to digital systems safely.
All right, so all of that said, authentication is not authorization. I mean, it seems like they would go hand in hand. What's the difference between the two?
At first glance, it's easy to get the two confused. You might think an authenticated password authorizes me to access my account, right? That's only partially correct. In the security field, authorization goes deeper than that. In fact, authorization plays a big part of computer security. If authentication is the process of proving you are who you say, then authorization is the process where the system figures out what you're allowed to access. To revisit our Amazon example, you don't suddenly gain the site's administrator privileges when you log in with your consumer account. The site needs to determine what level of permission you have to move forward. So basically, authorization is a check on what you're able to do with valid authentication methods. It also opens the door for guest users and non-authenticated computer usage. Access control through carefully delegated permissions and authorization, it demands robust authentication. Otherwise, your system will never have a reliable way to tell who it should allow to undertake that action. But before being allowed to add or delete files from hard drives, install software, or muck around on the machine in any way, proof is going to be required. So after authenticating your identity with your password or the other factors we'll go over, the machine authorizes you to undertake certain actions. A guest user on a library computer can't wipe the operating system, but the system administrator can. The software authenticates itself within your computer too, though it's a little different. For example, if you've ever heard of code signing, it's a method developers use to guarantee that the software supplied is valid and it's safe to run. Code signing uses digital signatures, which use hashing techniques to verify the code that you received is the exact copy of what the developer published. If you've ever read Apple's patch notes, you've probably seen the fixes that relate to issues of authentication and authorization. We talk about this a lot when certain types of malware bypass, defeat, or exploit system security so it could run code without proper authentication. Sometimes the malware finds a way to bypass the authentication process, which fools macOS's gatekeeper into thinking the malware is legitimate software. This results in the software becoming authorized to run on your computer. In some cases, like on websites full of personal info, such as social media or banking sites, you must authenticate yourself more than once to gain additional authorization. Someone who is logged into their Facebook account, as one example, must re-enter their password to do something like add a phone number or delete their page. Re-entering a password is a way to re-authenticate a person to ensure they are indeed who they actually say they are. This is important because many of these sites, after you log in, keep you logged in so you don't have to put your username or password each and every time you visit the site. That's why re-authentication is a good and valid check when making updates of sensitive information to your accounts.
Re-authentication is such a pain. Re-authentication is such a pain, but it makes perfect sense. There are like 3 or 4 times in what you were just talking about. Well, 2 that leap to mind right now, but I remember there were a few others. When you're talking about authorization, this is one of the reasons that you guys say, okay, you've got an admin account, but you should make another account that is your user account and still another account that's your guest account. Because your guest, you probably don't want doing anything but maybe surfing the web. You, on the other hand, want to be able to surf the web and you want to be able to add files and delete files, but you don't want to accidentally, let's say, delete something or do some serious damage to your computer. The other thing, and this is true with authentication for like Facebook or something like that, I hand my phone to someone else, or I leave my phone sitting on the desk and somebody else picks my phone up. Or I'm at the coffee shop and I'm not going to bother to close my computer and actually go up there because all I want is a refill of my coffee. At that point, somebody could, cause a distraction and either take my computer, and they've got access to my Facebook stuff, they've got access to my banking stuff, which could be much more serious if the reauthorization thing isn't there. The fact that Facebook is going to come back to me and say, okay, I know you were who you said you were 5 minutes ago, but are you still who you said you were, and you want to do this serious thing now, so seriously, let's make sure you are who you say. I mean, is that sort of like an accurate illustration of why all of that is so important?
Exactly. I mean, another situation that springs to mind would be if you log in on a public computer at a school, library, or a friend's computer, you're not going to want them later on accessing your bank details.
I would really, that's something you're going to suggest people not do anyway.
I was just about to say that. I'm like, you know what? Don't log into other people's computers. Just don't. Use your own. If you can't use your own, wait.
Yeah, definitely wait.
It's okay. Yes, and yes, and yes. You're right, but there are going to be emergencies, and at the very least, it is good to know that. I mean, if your institution that you're logging into is worth its salt, salt. If it's worth its salt, then at least there is sort of something that's going around behind you going, okay, we need to make doubly sure that you're still the person who should be authorizing this.
Actually, an additional side note there, a lot of websites, I know Gmail does it, Facebook, a lot of the social media, all that kind of stuff will usually have a link that tells you, hey, you're logged in more than one location, and you can actually sign yourself out of all those other locations. So if you did log into your friend's computer or phone or whatever and you realize it, hopefully your friend is trustworthy, but just in case, go ahead and log into your account on your own computer and click that sign out link. Sign out all of your other sessions, and then you don't have to worry. They won't be able to do anything.
Yeah, did your profile picture get changed to something random? Things like that.
Right.
That could be the cause of it. Don't freak out. Well, maybe you should freak out a little bit.
Okay, so lots of different reasons for authentication, lots of different reasons why we might be asked for authentication again, even if we've already offered it. There are 3 major categories of authentication, or authentication factors, rather. Talk to me about those.
Yeah, so since authentication is all about proving your ownership of an account and gaining access to something, there are different ways to do it. In the area of the security world, you'll hear the word factor thrown around a lot. And factor is kind of a bit of industry jargon to refer to the different methods we have for authentication. So with that in mind, there are 3 main groups. Obviously, there's more than just the plain old password to authenticate yourself with. You've probably actually already done this before, even if you didn't think about it at the time. Generally speaking, there are knowledge factors, inherence factors, and ownership factors. And altogether, these cover a lot of ground and encompass many of the different ways to identify yourself. And they provide a lot of potential combinations, which makes it harder for someone to impersonate another person or impersonate you. Some of them are only useful in limited contexts, while others are pretty broad. So let's start by looking at knowledge factors, since they're by far the most common type that we see and use. And we've talked about usernames and passwords quite a bit, and those are knowledge factors. Sometimes knowledge factors are referred to as something you know. It's relatively easy to remember only a single password, but it can be a challenge to remember more than one. So on its own, a password is not really enough to provide true security, especially because many people reuse passwords across multiple websites. We've talked about that problem on the show before. If they use a word like password or 123456 for their password, that happens way too often, and it's not good enough. But a password isn't the only knowledge factor. There are also secret questions, and you've probably already encountered secret questions when you were setting up an online bank account or trying to reset your password. And those questions can be stuff like, what's your mother's maiden name? Or what was the make and model of your first car? Basically, the idea is to create a relatively unique identifier that only you can answer. Questions lately have become much more specific to reduce the chance that someone could guess the answer, since we post everything on social media. You post where you went to high school, you post your mom, you're friends with your mom, you post pictures of your car. It's those really basic questions aren't good enough anymore.
Throwback Thursday, man.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty much.
That didn't even occur to me. That's insane.
And because it's so easy to kind of guess at least some of those answers to security questions, is why websites often require more than one security answer in order to do something. Another type of knowledge factor is just a PIN, like what you punch in at the ATM. Now, even taken together, knowledge factors aren't really enough today to provide good security, because social engineering or keylogging, all these other types of methods can leave a knowledge factor vulnerable to interception or theft. That's why we also use ownership factors in increasing numbers. Ownership factors are something you own or have possession of, and it comes in plenty of different forms as well. One ownership factor that you probably interact with pretty regularly is your bank card itself. When you want to get money out of the ATM, you aren't just punching in your PIN and getting the cash, you have to insert your card. The same principle applies to computers using what are often called tokens. Security tokens come in many shapes and sizes, and not all of them are actual physical tokens. If you've ever used Google's Authenticator app on your smartphone or one of the security key applications, I know Blizzard uses them for World of Warcraft. Steam uses them for online gaming. Those are ownership factors. You own your smartphone, so it's assumed that if you can authenticate yourself on the phone, the app can generate a secure key for you. Websites that send you one of those text messages with a one-time code are also supplying you with an ownership factor. Software-based keys like this are increasingly common, but there are still hardware dongles, kind of old school, like the RSA Secure ID. They still exist. They're still in common use in some situations. Some of these hardware units communicate with a home server to verify that they're valid. Others, like the Secure ID, they're not connected to the internet at all. They're fully offline. They generate a random secure string based on programming built into the device itself. And then the server authenticates that through a complex algorithm. Other types of hardware keys will actually physically plug into your computer, usually like a little USB dongle. A lot of times those are the case when you have sensitive applications. Some programs and apps will actually use it to kind of in place of a serial number or a license key, you have to have the physical dongle plugged in order for the program to work. And finally, for the third of the factors, there are inherence factors, which kind of might be the simplest of all, and yet they're actually the hardest to duplicate. They're things that are inherent to each individual and thus unique by nature. Your voice, for example, could be used to authenticate yourself. More commonly, smartphones today often include a fingerprint scanner for quickly unlocking your phone or making a payment. iPhone obviously does this. Apple recently put that technology into the latest MacBook Pros, at least latest as of the time of this recording. The pattern of your retina might be another thing that you could use to authenticate yourself. Inherence is all about biometrics. and provides an excellent level of security, but it does come with some fairly understandable privacy concerns. If someone's going to be storing a copy of your fingerprint or your voice print, it needs to be behind the strongest digital lock and key possible. And again, that's still, biometrics aren't even 100% secure because there are methods of duplicating your fingerprints in some cases. Biometrics is still an emerging field within authentication technology, but even so, it's starting to play more of an important part in authentication procedures.
Okay, so then how do these three types of authentication, how do they work?
As we mentioned, the three authentication factors can create opportunities for some pretty secure access and authorization modes. As a result, though, the way we identify ourselves digitally is undergoing a major shift. Two-factor authentication is more than a buzzword now. Many major sites have it as a cornerstone for their login security systems. Some of the biggest companies like Google, Facebook, Twitter all see the value in adding new layers of complexity to their login systems. But when you hear two-factor authentication, does it make you wonder if there are other types? And there are, but two-factor authentication, or 2FA, it's all about taking the identity factors we discussed earlier and putting them into practice. Single-factor authentication is the most common, and it's exactly what it sounds like. You supply a single secret piece of information for a computer to validate. If it's legitimate, you gain access. If it's not, you don't. Either way, you don't need to supply anything else. Now, your iPhone allows you to use the inherence factor of a fingerprint to unlock it, while your email account usually only requires a password. Either instance is an example of single-factor authentication at work. Unfortunately, we shouldn't depend solely on the security of a hashing algorithm to keep us safe. While you might get by with single-factor authentication in some cases, a more rigorous approach is better. Now, that's where two-factor authentication comes into play. The most common way to encounter two-factor authentication today is through a combination of a knowledge factor and an ownership factor. A text message often comprises the ownership factor. When you try to log into a website where you've enabled two-factor authentication, entering a correct password will trigger the server to send a message to a phone number on file. You then get a one-time code that is only valid for a few minutes. After the server verifies it is the correct code, you can't use that code again. However, you've now authenticated and are able to access the website. Google's Authenticator app works roughly the same way. The RSA Secure ID was one of the first and most popular two-factor solutions for a long time. It was a hardware token that people typically attach to their key rings or work badges. Now that smartphones and texting are everywhere, hardware tokens that are easily lost or stolen have decreased in popularity. Instead, RSA now offers keys tied to the phone itself. Overall, two-factor authentication offers a huge leap in security, even if it sacrifices some of the convenience of an instant login. No matter how many of your passwords a hacker steals, they'll have trouble breaking into your account without your phone. The mere presence of two-factor authentication can act as a deterrent in some cases, sending the bad guys onto other targets. Multiple factor authentication, or MFA, also exists, though in much less widespread form. Few people face such huge security demands that they need to present 3 separate instances of personal info to authenticate. However, It can, and it does happen. And not just in super secret government installations inside the CIA or NSA. Multi-factor authentication requires ownership and knowledge factors and the presentation of a biometric identifier as well. Retinal scans and voice identification are often the most common component in MFA setups. You might also encounter MFA where you need 2 ownership factors and 1 knowledge factor, or any combination thereof.
So, okay, back in the day, I had a username and a password, and I was good, or at least I thought I was good. More and more of the services that I'm using now, I have that, and then I also have, more and more of the services I use now do require two-factor authentication. When you talk about MFA, that makes me think that the days of security with two-factor authentication are numbered.
Two-factor authentication it's obviously better than single-factor authentication, but it's not perfect, and security concerns do still exist with it. As we add more layers to our security and kind of depend on our computers and digital devices to hold larger amounts of our private information, strengthening our authentication methods makes perfect sense. And it doesn't mean that we've perfected everything, or that two-factor authentication will always be enough to keep unwanted individuals away from our accounts. Someone's always looking for ways to compromise or undermine the integrity of all of those digital systems. After all, if we had a perfectly secure way to authenticate and authorize, we would hardly ever have to worry about identity theft or malware, and obviously that's not the case in reality. Two-factor authentication can fail in several different ways, and there have been some notable incidences where breaches have occurred. It doesn't mean that you need to be fearful or an inability to protect your account with two-factor authentication, just that you should be aware of how important good security practices are. So some of the instances where two-factor authentication has come up short. Well, we mentioned the RSA Secure ID a few times already in this show. When it first came out, it dominated the market for years and years as the most viable two-factor authentication solution. And then in 2011, the company was forced to drop a bombshell on its consumers because Secure ID had been compromised. RSA employees had been tricked by phishing emails. I've mentioned that a few times on this show. They're tricked into opening fake Excel files that happen to be loaded with malware. After the payload was installed onto their computers, hackers entered RSA servers, stole unknown quantities of data. Bad times came after that. The company has actually kept most of the details of what was stolen under wraps because don't want to give the bad guys an upper hand. But later in the year, a major defense company suffered an attack, and it was reported to be related to the Secure ID breach, at which point RSA came clean, offered to replace the hardware tokens used by any of its customers to ensure that the secret data used to create the unique tokens was brand new, no way related to what they had used on the compromised servers. And that incident kind of clearly demonstrated the incredible power that phishing has and how it can impact security, and one of the more unexpected ways in which two-factor authentication might be compromised. Other issues can cause failures of two-factor authentication. Late last year, PayPal had to issue a patch for their own two-factor system that used security questions because simply changing a value in the HTTP request sent to the server would allow a username and password alone to provide authentication. It totally ignored and skipped the second part of two-factor authentication and went back to single-factor. While breaches compromising the actual integrity of keys are rare, attackers are always looking for ways to kind of work around the need for it in the first place. Social engineering is also a risk when it comes to multi-factor authentication, as you could be tricked into giving up that secret code to an attacker. Some individuals trying to social engineer their way into Google accounts would send an official-looking text message to a user requesting a 6-digit code, and they would then attempt to log into the account, triggering that two-factor authentication text to the real user, who would then send the code back to the original texter, and boom, the bad guys have the info. If you were kind of paranoid and took a close look at that text message in the first place, you might figure out that it's not real, but there were plenty of people who would fall for that trap. Some social engineering efforts will try and cut you out of the picture altogether. In several cases, determined attackers have gained access to accounts by calling the companies themselves and impersonating a user. With enough know-how and social engineering, they convince the person on the other end of the line to disable two-factor authentication entirely, or change the phone number that's in their system so those codes go to the attacker's phone number instead of yours. As a result, there's a concern that SMS messages might not be the best way to deliver those authentication codes. Instead, a secure and encrypted app that can generate the key on your smartphone or device itself might be the better solution. Attacks directly on the authentication procedures themselves can yield some success as well. In 2014, hackers used a phishing campaign to distribute a fake Android two-factor authentication app. And rather than generating keys, the app was malware disguised as a legitimate app. And anytime you received one of those text messages with the two-factor authentication codes from your bank, for example, that message would instead route to the hackers. So, again, efforts like this that compromise or circumvent two-factor authentication are ongoing as more and more companies and sites implement it. Though there have been few notably large breaches that caused damage, it's clear that there are still security concerns here, and that the hackers won't stop trying to work around the security systems. Hardened systems and a continued exploration of how to improve the identification factors that we use can help mitigate some of these risks that we face. So the next time you enter your password into Facebook or type that 6-digit code in from Google, stop and think about everything that is happening behind the scenes to keep you safe and secure. We're entering into an age where single-factor authentication might go extinct pretty soon, but, with the exception of those really basic authentication needs. Identity theft and security concerns continue to drive us toward a world where we regularly use a wide variety of factors to authenticate ourselves.
So, every chance that you guys get, do you enable two-factor authentication? I mean, some places require you to do it. Some places don't even offer it. And then other places give you incentives to do it. In the business world, we see companies offering discounts for enabling two-factor authentication. Like on one side of it, it's that extra step. And the company that comes to mind uses the Google Authenticator app. It definitely is an extra step. As the business owner, it saves me some money off my subscription fees of things. But the other side of it is more and more companies, it's becoming more often that they're getting hacked. And so rather than people just automatically being able to log into your account, there is that second step right there.
Yeah, whenever possible, I go for those extra steps. It can be a pain, especially if you haven't closed your web browser and it's 5 minutes later and it's not that important of a site that's already asking you to enter the authenticator code again. That can be a bit annoying. But in reality, I would much rather have those 5 seconds of time that it takes to grab the code and enter it than the account be hacked because they misconfigured one thing on their server and somebody was able to get in. I guess when it comes to security, it is always a balance of your time and energy versus what you're protecting. And in a lot of cases, with everything we put online and how important that data is, it's worth the extra steps to take, even if it's a bit of a pain. I know a lot of sites do or have started offering two-factor authentication, but not every site does. And that kind of, brings to mind something we've discussed previously on earlier episodes, password security. If your site does not offer two-factor authentication, make sure you're at least using a unique password for that site. Don't reuse the same password everywhere, because if one site gets hacked and your password gets out there, hey, look, they can log into any other site that doesn't use two-factor authentication if you use the same password there. So, whenever possible, go ahead and enable it if it's not too much of a hassle for you, especially with things like your bank account. But if your site or service doesn't offer it, at least make a strong, unique password for it. And that's about the best you can do for security until they start offering something stronger.
No, definitely reach out to them. Tell them two-factor authentication. I mean, increase security by all means. Remember when you used to reset a password and they used to email you your password in plain text?
Oh, yes. And email used to be routed not securely. Actually, still not routed securely a lot of the time. It's like sending a postcard.
So, if you ever run into a service that does send you your password in plain text, if it's not a temporary password, heck, even that. I mean, there's so many alternatives that these companies and sites could be doing, and bring it to their attention. And a lot of times, just bringing it up will cause change, will create better security.
The other thing, too, is just... I mean, you really have to be careful about how you think about security. As we were going through this show, you guys were saying, I can't remember which one of you it was, I apologize, but you're like, okay, so you're trying to log into your phone and you do your thumbprint on your phone. So there's your inherent authorization or authentication there. There's your inherent authentication there, and that's only single authentication. And I was like, wait a minute, no, it's not single because I've got ownership because I have my phone.
You've got ownership of your phone, exactly.
Right, and then I've got my finger on there, and so that's my second factor. But it's really still just one factor because my phone, while I sort of in my head think of my phone as a gateway, the phone is actually the computer. I wouldn't sit down and say, well, I have two factors because I have my Mac and I have my password. I would say, well, that's only one way to do that, which, actually with an older Mac is the only option you have, unless you, well, as far as I know anyway. You kind of have to think, well, you have to be like Apple and think different about how secure your security actually is.
And I was actually thinking about that earlier, too, whether or not that would be one factor or two-factor. An example where your phone and your thumbprint could be two-factor would be something like Apple Pay. You're at the checkout line, you have your phone, you own your phone, and then your inherent factor, your fingerprint on the fingerprint reader for Apple Pay transaction to go through. That would be where your phone is two-factor. But yeah, it kind of depends situationally.
But it is single factor getting into your phone. I mean, your phone is right. So your phone is the second factor for using Apple Pay, but your thumbprint is the single factor for getting into your phone.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is, man, security's tough, but of course it's also worth it. We cover a lot of information on every episode. I say this every week. It's because we do. We cover a lot of information on every episode. The good news is there's another way for you to go back and dig deeper into the information that we've covered. Not just listen to the podcast again, although, that wouldn't kill you. SecureMac.com/checklist is the website to check out our show notes. That's for notes for previous shows, for this current show, and for all the shows going forward. SecureMac.com/checklist. If you have a question you'd like to ask or a topic you'd like to hear us hit, we do have an email address. It is checklist@securemac.com. That address again is checklist@securemac.com. And if you can't remember that, do remember this. You are listening to The Checklist, brought to you by Secure Mac. And we'll talk to you next week.